All right, welcome to the first lesson of APUSH Period 8B. Today we've got Nixon and Vietnam. Starting in 1969, our context is coming out of the incredibly turbulent year of 1968, which culminated in the election of Richard Milhous Nixon as president. He took office in January of 1969, and his promise to heal America's wounds was something that he was incapable of. Now, here's a thematic map of Nixon's intent in regards to Vietnam. I put this out here so you have a sense of where we're going. But today we're going to be looking at these events in chronological order. And at the end, we can come back to them thematically. Now, Nixon's strategy was hampered by real life, that there were a lot of factors beyond Nixon's control. And part of that was the America post-Tet Offensive. And that was the so-called living room war, with the news cameras and magazines and newspapers giving constant updates about Vietnam. It was in America's faces in a way that World War II or Korea or anything else could not be. Even Life magazine, which is as grandma baseball and apple pie as they come, were running articles like this in 1969. The faces of the American dead in Vietnam, 1 week's toll, and spread it across 12 pages are 242 pictures of just name, age, hometown, and it reads like a very grim yearbook. And these types of images cause Americans to think, like, is this worth the cost? You can see here, if you pause the video, you can take a moment to read these reactions, and it shows the divide that America was experiencing in 1969. A second factor in Nixon's Vietnam was the growing counterculture. The counterculture movement had multiple points of origin, but they were geographically separated. You had to go somewhere, San Francisco, New York City. All of a sudden, the counterculture in 1969 is going to become increasingly mainstream and available to more and more young people. The music had really taken these ideas mainstream, and nothing represents this more than, of course, Woodstock. A lot of people view Woodstock as kind of the beginning of the hippie movement. It really isn't the beginning of the hippie movement. It's really the end of the legitimate hippie movement. It's now the commercialization of the hippie movement, a mainstreaming of these counterculture ideas that, sex, drugs, and rock and roll that could be found throughout the counterculture. But it is a preeminent cultural moment for baby boomers. Hundreds of thousands of hippies showed up. Typical fashion, more than half of them broke down the gates and stormed in without paying anything. In terms of the event, it could have gone far worse, certainly. And if you were into the music at the time, it was a pretty amazing lineup. Here we have Jimi Hendrix doing his famous Star Spangled Banner wake-up call. And Woodstock really forced America to have a larger discussion, which has been ongoing, I think. Were the hippies, about peace, love, and understanding, or were they a bunch of dirty bums who refused to go to work and lived in a van? The answer, of course, is probably some mixture of both. Here we have Life magazine again, broadcasting Woodstock to the world. And now, teenagers in Peoria, Illinois could read and see all of these events. And of course, it was not a big jump from peace, love, and understanding to being anti-war. And there are plenty of images we see from the time period here. A third factor that really defined Nixon and Vietnam was his deliberate decision to change the draft system. So let's do a little exploration of LBJ's draft system here in this short video.
A need for more manpower upon America's deeper involvement in the Vietnam War in 1965 made President Johnson bring in conscription. Now young men, who were not considering military service, would consider whether they might get picked to fight in the Vietnam conflict across the globe. While 2/3 of Americans volunteered during the Vietnam War, the other third would be drafted. All males aged 18 to 26 were required to register for the draft. The names of American men of draft age were recorded by the Selective Service System. When called out by the local draft board, which was often composed of veterans, he would be evaluated on whether he would be drafted in the military or not. The local board's decisions were often seen as unfair. Most of the men chosen were from poor and working class backgrounds, people of color, and people from rural towns and farming communities. Draft boards would frequently defer middle-class men, who they would see as having valuable futures, and the upper classes were barely drafted at all. There were many ways in which draftees could be deferred or exempt from the draft. For example, men who were medically unfit, men who were married with children, or students at college. Men who had held college deferments were eligible for induction until age 35, but as few men between the ages of 26 and 35 were ever drafted. They could maintain a college deferment until their 26th birthday and avoid service altogether. Some draft resistors could be put in jail for refusing to fight in the war. They broke the law by escaping the draft, by refusing to turn up to the local board or fleeing to Canada. Those who were opposed to the draft became known as draft dodgers. When the war started, they were seen as cowards, but as the war dragged on and opposition to the draft grew, public attitude was more sympathetic.
Now, as you can see, LBJ's system with its deferments allowed a large number of so-called privileged Americans to skip Vietnam. This led to the criticism that it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Under the deferment system, it was possible to avoid the war through any number of ways. And so there was actually a growing draft resistance movement. There were people who were so blatant as just to burn their draft cards, but there were others who were seeking to educate the public, that to pursue ways by which they would not have to go to Vietnam. These efforts are seen in this parody called the Draft Dodger Rag.
Oh, I'm just a typical American boy from a typical American town. I believe in God and Senator Dodd, and I keep an old Castro down. And when it came my time to serve, I knew better dead than red. But when I got to my old draft board, buddy, this is what I said. Sarge, I'm only 18, I got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat, and my feet are flat, and my asthma's getting worse. Yes, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school, and I'm a-working in a defense plant. I got a dislocated disc and a racked up back, I'm allergic to flowers and bugs. And when the bombshell hits, I get epileptic fits, and I'm addicted to 1,000 drugs. I got the weakness woes, I can't touch my toes, I can hardly reach my knees. And if the enemy came close to me, oh, I'd probably start to sneeze. I'm only 18, got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat, and my feet are flat, and my asthma's getting worse. Yes, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school, and I'm a-working in a defense plant. Ooh, I hate show and lie, and I hope he dies. But one thing you gotta see, that someone's gotta go over there, and that someone isn't me. So I wish you well, Sarge, give him hell. Kill me 1,000 or so. And if you ever get a war without blood and gore, I'll be the first to go. Yes, I'm only 18, I got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat, and my feet are flat, and my asthma's getting worse. Yes, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school, and I'm working in a defense plant.
One category of deferment that was available was called conscientious objection. You could say that you were morally opposed to war. One such claim, famously, came from Muhammad Ali, which, if you are not familiar, it was seemed ironic because he was a professional boxer. But he did not support our war in Southeast Asia. You can see him here and with Martin Luther King Jr. right there next to him. Now, claiming conscientious objection did not mean that you would be necessarily out of Vietnam. There were a significant number of conscientious objectors who were sent to Vietnam, but with a medical kit instead of a rifle. In the Nixon administration, there were significant changes to the draft, where basically they would get rid of nearly all of the deferments and put everybody now into a birthday lottery system. 366 blue capsules, each containing a birthday, would be drawn from a bin, and the order that they were drawn would determine whether or not you were going to Vietnam. Now, this may sound a lot like the Hunger Games, and perhaps it is very similar, but this was seen as a more fair way to address some of the problems in the LBJ draft. The first year that the draft lottery occurred was in 1970. And here is the birthday chart for 1970. You may want to pause here, find your birthday, figure out what your number is. So if you have a low number, you are most likely going to Vietnam if you're a boy. If you have a high number, you are probably not going to get drafted. The question is, what number was safe? Out of 366, how low was low? The answer in 1970 was 215. 215 was called up for a medical physical, and up to 195 were actually drafted in 1970 and sent to Vietnam. So, did you make it? Because Nixon canceled nearly all of the deferments. Besides those who were medically ineligible, one group that was not going to get sent to Vietnam were those serving in our National Guard. This led to the National Guard being a very popular place to try and get into. And it became known as kind of a safe haven for wealthy kids to get out of going to Vietnam. All of this has a context for Kent State, where we will find a very strange scenario here between students who used to be safe from the draft now being sort of policed by other students who are still have their get out of Vietnam free card. Some of the things that define Nixon's Vietnam are really beyond his control and certainly not his intent. One of those was the so-called My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre actually occurred during the Johnson presidency. It happened in 1968, but news of it came live in 1969. Here was incontrovertible evidence that American soldiers had been involved in the killing of over 500 unarmed civilians. There were images of slain women and babies. And the My Lai massacre had far-reaching consequences. Not only did it create sympathy for what we were doing to the Vietnamese, but it really raised sympathy for what Vietnam was doing to our boys. How could our boys that we sent over be involved in something like this? And it contributed to the larger discussion of whether or not the cost was for Vietnam was simply too high.
If you take the total number of people who died at My Lai, which was 507, and put that alongside the 2 million civilians who died, it doesn't seem very much. But in terms of impact on America and on the rest of the world about how they conducted that war, clearly it changed people's opinions towards the war. It was too big a price to pay that if you were going to have to win this war by this kind of conduct, and it wasn't a price worth paying.
People had been saying to themselves, well, what are we doing to these people? What are we doing to them? And then with My Lai, people began to say, what is it doing to us?
Oh, it hurts me thinking about the innocent people that got killed. It hurts me now. It hurts me now more than it did then. Because then you're thinking about living. You get out and you're a civilian, you think about dying.
It's been a while. Now I can sleep, but every once in a while, I dream again about how my father died, how my sister died, how they died next to me. I saw it all. I remember all the time.
I could go back and remember all the sleepless nights that we had, everything that went on, my life, all the people that were killed here. Every day I try to make it easy. I thought that by drinking that I could make it easy and make it go away. I'd lay down at night, it's still the same thing. Whether I drank or whether I didn't drink, it's still the same thing. Just the memories kept coming back, kept coming back.
I will never forget. When I am reminded, I suddenly remember the pain. A chapter in the book opens. There is no way I will ever forget.
As far as living with the shame of My Lai, I have no shame. I did what I was supposed to be doing. The shame rests with the politicians and the military, not with me, the other members of Charlie Company, Lieutenant Calley, or Captain Medina. The shame lays with them. It's a national shame.
Another defining element of the effects of Vietnam during the Nixon years was the growing unrest on college campuses. If we think about student activism through the civil rights movement, this kind of agitation had occurred while the students were generally immune to being sent to Vietnam. Now, under Nixon's draft, students are no longer exempt. And there was a growing frustration among young people about the fact that they could be sent to Vietnam when they were 18, but they couldn't vote until they were 21. You know, how much worse than no taxation without representation is being sent to Vietnam without representation. The drinking age was also 21, which many people felt there was a gross injustice that they could go and fight and die in Southeast Asia, but they couldn't have a beer. And the result of this agitation is that both of these things changed. The 26th Amendment was added to the Constitution, changing the voting age to 18, which 18 to 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds still notoriously don't vote. So get out there and vote, kids. And the drinking age was lowered to 18 until teenagers made a lot of bad choices in the 1970s, and they eventually changed it back to 21 in the 1980s. Now, one of the key things for Nixon was that he felt that LBJ had not won the war because he had limited himself, that he had weaknesses, that they had not bombed North Vietnam adequately, that they had not pursued the enemy into neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos so as to disrupt a key element of the war called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I want to show you this post on the Ho Chi Minh Trail now.
Deep in the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers from both sides battled heat exhaustion and each other for nearly 20 long years. But the key to communist victory wasn't weapons or stamina, it was a dirt road. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, winding through Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, started as a simple network of dirt roads and blossomed into the centrepiece of the winning North Vietnamese strategy during the Vietnam War, supplying weapons, troops and psychological support to the south. The trail was a network of tracks, dirt roads and river crossings that threaded west out of North Vietnam and south along the Truong Son mountain range between Vietnam and Laos. The journey to the south originally took 6 months, but with engineering and ingenuity, the Vietnamese expanded and improved the trail. Towards the end of the war, as the main routes detoured through Laos, it only took 1 week. Here is how it happened. In 1959, as relations deteriorated between the North and the South, a system of trails was constructed in order to infiltrate soldiers, weapons and supplies into South Vietnam. The first troops moved in single file along routes used by local ethnic groups, and broken tree branches at dusty crossroads were often all that indicated the direction. By 1965, the trip down the trail could be made by truck. Thousands of trucks supplied by China and Russia took up the task amidst ferocious B-52 bombing, and truck drivers became known as pilots of the ground. As the traffic down the trail increased, so did the US bombing. They drove at night or in the early morning to avoid airstrikes, and watchmen were ready to warn drivers of enemy aircraft. Villages along the trail organised teams to guarantee traffic flow and to help drivers repair damage caused by air attacks. Their catch cries were, "Everything for our southern brothers." The Ho Chi Minh Trail had a profound impact on the Vietnam War, and it was the key to Hanoi's success. North Vietnamese victory was not determined by the battlefields, but by the trail, which was the political, strategic and economic linchpin. Americans recognised its achievement, calling the trail one of the great achievements of military engineering of the 20th century. The trail is a testimony to the strength of will of the Vietnamese people, and the men and women who use the trail have become folk heroes.
So Nixon's thought was that if they aggressively pursued the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia, they might provide key relief for the government of South Vietnam, and that by expanding the war into these neighboring countries, they could win the war. This led to a real sense of frustration that Nixon had lied to the country, that the so-called peace that he had offered, that he was going to wind down the war, that this was not the case. And people were beginning to feel that peace with honor went not peace, but peace when we win. And there was a growing sense of young people who are against the war. You can see these primary documents here. You might notice they are from the Cleveland area. And it says, high school students, it is your legal right to distribute this leaflet at your school. So the question is, why would high school students now be involved in the anti-war movement? Well, of course, now the draft has reached into the suburbs. And so older siblings and their own sense of fear has created this movement. This led to a giant march on Washington. This was about twice, almost 3 times the size of Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington, but it's very little noted by history, but a significant outpouring of young people and other anti-war movement activists. And it was the expansion of the war into Cambodia that led to the agitation that we find at Kent State, where outside agitators, a combination of people, had growing frustrations, had led to the events at Kent State. There had been violence. There had been the burning down of the Army building on campus. And then the National Guard had been dispatched. And the shootouts at Kent State are really, even to this day, controversial. There is considerable analytical debate over the quality of the sound recordings and who shot first and was there an order. But the tragedy is that they didn't just shoot down a bunch of hippies, but a lot of the people who got shot down were not even necessarily at the protest. But here you have a person just walking through a parking lot who was hit. And the vast majority of Americans sided with the National Guard, not with the students at Kent State. Another key factor that defined Nixon's Vietnam was an event called the Pentagon Papers. And this involves what we might call whistleblowing, a conscientious release of top secret information thought to be in the public good. So I want to roll you this story here on the Pentagon Papers.
The war in Vietnam tears America apart. Anti-war activists take to the streets, and the government reacts with tear gas and bayonets. Unknown to the American public, a secret report was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The highly classified document contains evidence of lying by the government about the reasons the war is being fought and the probability of success. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, one of the select group of Pentagon analysts who wrote the classified study, turns against the war.
They were prepared to prolong a war, and expand a war at each step, rather than to lose it, and Nixon was the same.
I want to end this war. The American people want to end this war.
Ellsberg believes that Nixon's pledge to get out of Vietnam is not to be trusted.
All I could do was to put out top secret documents of history showing every previous president acted the way I claim Nixon is acting. Read this and see if you don't think you should look very closely at what Nixon is doing. Challenge him, have hearings, call witnesses, find out whether he really means to get out.
Ellsberg leaks the secret documents to the New York Times. Editors have to decide whether to publish them. It causes a heated debate within the paper. The decision to make the papers public is not an easy one. Stakes are high.
Because, you know, if we were wrong and this was something that hurt a single soldier, we would live with it forever.
Sunday, June 13th, 1971. The New York Times begins its explosive series based on the Pentagon Papers.
I felt that we were doing our duty. I knew the government would have a heart attack.
The Nixon administration is outraged. They say printing classified documents in the New York Times risks national security.
We subscribe to the Bill of Rights, but they are not absolute in any circumstance.
The Attorney General orders the New York Times to stop, but the paper refuses and lands in federal court.
The United States of America comes into the courtroom for the first time in the history of our republic and asks for a temporary restraining order restraining the nation's most preeminent newspaper, the New York Times, from further publishing material because of national security considerations. It never before had happened.
The case quickly advances to the Supreme Court. 9 justices will have to decide if the government has proved the publication of the Pentagon Papers is so dangerous it must be stopped. What is really at stake? Soldiers' lives or politicians' reputations? On June 30th, 1971, in a hushed and expectant courtroom, the decision is announced. It is 6-3 for the press.
I think it's reaffirmed the fact that that a free press in our country is entitled to run the way people like to run a free press, that the government can't just march in and stop us from publishing.
The Pentagon Papers, the real consequence for the Pentagon Papers is that it had revealed that Americans had been lied to consistently about Vietnam, that throughout the Johnson years, even back to the Kennedy years, Americans had received untruths. And this went, as big of information as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that was the legal justification for the war, was revealed to be nebulous or sketchy at best and outlined fraudulent at worst. And we see here Nixon's advisor, Haldeman, this quote here: "The implicit infallibility of presidents," the idea that presidents are trustworthy, that they don't do wrong, that they have the best interests of America at heart. This is something that will not survive the Nixon years. And we'll get into that part in part 2 tomorrow when we look at Nixon and Watergate. This culminates in a growing cynicism and anti-Nixon feelings among certain parts of Americans. There are, of course, a lot of people who love Nixon and who love his vice president, Spiro T. Agnew, but the so-called silent majority that Nixon represents is facing a growing opposition from the country. And we have like a real divide. If you feel like that we're experiencing partisan divide now, and this is fairly new, it would not feel new to anyone in the Nixon administration, in the real sense that we were living in 2 Americas. But you do see this cynicism, a cynicism settling in, a besmirching here of Uncle Sam, not as you are used to seeing him. It wouldn't have been unusual to find these kind of anti-war sentiments on a middle school kid's backpack by 1970, 71. And of course, this is the Pietà of Mary and the slain Jesus. This is certainly cynical look. One thing that made the war difficult to resolve was the so-called Vietnam veterans against the war, that there were people who had been there, who had served, who are coming back and saying, look, you don't really know what this is like. We know what this is like. We're not just a bunch of cowards. We're not just a bunch of doped hippies, but we served, and we can tell you that we should not be there, that we are not helping these people. And this message became very difficult. Americans weren't sure what to do with this. Vietnam veterans against the war were trying to raise veterans issues, that the government had not been forthcoming in acknowledging a series of medical problems that would later be called Agent Orange syndrome that veterans were suffering from. And you had John Kerry, who would go on to be a senator and a presidential candidate, Secretary of State, who, as a young man, was wealthy. He could have avoided going to the war, but he did not. He went over, and when he came back, he was involved in this movement. So let's take a look at what he has to say here. In our opinion, and from our experience, there is nothing in South Vietnam which could happen that realistically threatens the United States of America. And to attempt to justify the loss of one American life in Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos by linking such loss to the preservation of freedom is to us the height of criminal hypocrisy. And it is that kind of hypocrisy which we feel has torn this country apart. Each day, someone has to give up his life so that the United States doesn't have to admit something that the entire world already knows, so that we can't say that we have made a mistake. Someone has to die so that President Nixon won't be, and these are his words, the first president to lose a war. We wish that a merciful God could wipe away our own memories of that service as easily as this administration has wiped away their memories of us. And I'm not sure what America would say to that. Now, Nixon's strategy ultimately was to try and find a soft landing for America to get out of Vietnam. There was a growing frustration in Congress, particularly among the Democrats in Congress, to cut funding and to cut authorization for Vietnam. They withdrew the Gulf of Tonkin resolution justifying the legal nature of the war, and yet the war continued. And so Nixon needed to find an alternative strategy, and that strategy became what was known as Vietnamization. We are going to, rather than fight the war in Vietnam, we are going to pour all of our energy into training the South Vietnamese and pass the war on to them. And I don't know if this was someone thought was a winning strategy, but it may have been the only politically tenable strategy as more and more Americans turned against the war. And of course, it won't be a winning strategy. If the South Vietnamese never needed us, then why were we there in the first place? And if they couldn't win with our help at 500,000 boys a year, how much training would make up for the loss of this kind of energy and money? And but it was the best that Nixon could manage. At the same time that Nixon was looking to reduce America's footprint of troops in Vietnam, Nixon also wanted to push past the limits that LBJ had put on civilian bombing of North Vietnam and launched Operation Linebacker, a full-on assault on North Vietnam to try and force them to their knees to arrive at a negotiated settlement in Vietnam. By the time he was done, we had dropped more tons of bombs in Vietnam than all of the sides combined in World War II, and it still did not produce the outcome that he was hoping for. Even as we withdrew our direct combat report, we continued to supply arms and ammunition. Probably the most notorious weapon of the Vietnam era was so-called napalm, which was a form of jellied gasoline that you would drop and it would splash and burn on the jungle or onto people. It's a terrible experience. And out of this came this image from South Vietnam and the horror and terror of this little girl whose clothes have been burned off, whose arm is on fire, and as they are fleeing their village, which had been napalmed by the South Vietnamese government. And this was a haunting image from the latter war years. But also with the passage of time, this little girl's story became better known. And so I want to share with you this audio clip from 2008, where we follow this girl, now grown and living in Canada.
One of the best-known photographs of the Vietnam War shows a group of children running down a road after napalm was dropped on their village. Among the children is a naked girl, her arms spread apart, badly burned, her face full of terror. The photo was taken 36 years ago this month, and our This I Believe essay today comes from the main subject of that photo, Kim Phuc, that girl, now grown. Here's our series curator, independent producer, Jay Allison.
Kim Phuc is known as the girl in the picture. She's 45 years old now and living in Toronto, Canada, with her husband and 2 children. Kim Phuc came to her belief literally by accident, and although it took a long time for her to find it, she has been sustained by it ever since. Here's Kim Phuc with her essay for This I Believe.
On June 8, 1972, I ran out from Cao Dai Temple in my village, Trang Bang, South Vietnam. I saw an airplane getting lower and then 4 bombs falling down. I saw fire everywhere around me. Then I saw the fire over my body, especially on my left arm. My clothes had been burned off by fire. I was 9 years old, but I still remember my thoughts at that moment. I would be ugly and people would treat me in a different way. My picture was taken in that moment on road number 1 from Saigon to Phnom Penh. After a soldier gave me some drink and poured water over my body, I lost my consciousness. Several days after, I realized that I was in a hospital where I spent 14 months and had 17 operations. It was a very difficult time for me when I went home from the hospital. Our house was destroyed. We lost everything, and we just survived day by day. Although I suffer from pain, itching, and headaches all the time, the long hospital stay made me dream to become a doctor. But my studies were cut short by the local government. They wanted me as a symbol of the state. I could not go to school anymore. The anger inside me was like a hatred as high as a mountain. I hated my life. I hated all people who were normal because I was not normal. I really wanted to die many times. I spent my daytime in the library to read a lot of religious books to find a purpose for my life. One of the books that I read was the Holy Bible. In Christmas 1982, I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. It was an amazing turning point in my life. God helped me to learn to forgive, the most difficult of all lessons. It didn't happen in a day, and it wasn't easy, but I finally got it. Forgiveness made me free from hatred. I still have many scars on my body and severe pain most days, but my heart is cleansed. Napalm is very powerful, but faith, forgiveness, and love are much more powerful. We would not have war at all if everyone could learn how to live with true love, hope, and forgiveness. If that little girl in the picture can do it, ask yourself, can you?
Okay, what an amazing story. It's amazing that through the depths of tragedy and despair and communism, God's Spirit is at work. And her testimony of love and forgiveness goes out as a part of the gospel even to today. Okay, we close today with a return to this thematic look at Nixon in Vietnam and how Nixon's attempt to change the draft brought a sense of more fairness, but those who had previously benefited from the system were up in arms about the changes. Nixon's goal was to create peace with honor in Vietnam, which turned out meant that he really wanted to win. He wanted to push beyond the limits that LBJ had set on the war and expand the war into Cambodia, engage in massive bombing. But this ultimately did not prevail for Nixon in Vietnam. The rest of the chart will make more sense tomorrow after we finish our second lesson on Nixon. So we will get into that tomorrow. Thanks for your kindly attention today, and have a good day.